Welcome to Orbicle Times podcast, and hello to everyone, whatever part of the globe you're from or happen to reside in. My name is Kelly Jo, and here we'll provide armchair conversations gathered from interviews and research reviews to explore the seen, the unseen, and the in-between of the supernatural paranormal phenomena, with topics that circle around spirit orbs, N.D.Es, O.B.Es, UFOs, time slips, mystical moments, higher consciousness, and more. I hope that this cast will be our meeting place and judge-free zone where we can explore, learn, and grow through the telling of. This cast will be launched on a monthly basis or a bi-weekly schedule whenever I'm able to make contact with those in the know for their telling of. Speaking of those in the know and the telling of, have you had mystical moments or other supernatural paranormal experiences? Care to share on this cast? Then consider stepping into the light with your telling of, or send in your monologue for me to read on this podcast. Simply email orbicletimespodcast@gmail.com for a chance to contribute to this cast. This episode of Orbicle Times will circle around some elements of a shared death experience and shed light on a few key pioneers in the field who also just happen to have had their own S.D.Es. So, what exactly is a shared death experience, or S.D.E? There doesn't seem to be the one go-to definitive or succinct definition for S.D.E. Well, not that I could find anyways. So I'll provide a few examples of definitions from individuals that are prominent researchers in the field of S.D.E. The term shared death experience, or S.D.E, is said to have been coined by psychiatrist, philosopher, and author Dr. Raymond Moody, and is noted in his 2009 book, Glimpses of Eternity. Moody, prior to 2009, is also credited with the creation of the phrase near-death experience. If you're interested in how Moody became interested, then please listen to my previous podcast entitled Elements in N.D.E. Moody and his longtime accomplished co-author, science writer, and documentary filmmaker Paul Perry, who himself had an S.D.E, have once again teamed up to write and publish a book entitled Proof of Life After Life, 7 Reasons to Believe There is an Afterlife. Yet another book that circles around S.D.Es. When Moody was asked in an interview what a shared death experience was, he replied, quote, "It is identically the same phenomenon as an N.D.E in that all the elements of the experience are the same, except that a shared death experience happens not to someone who almost dies and is revived, but rather a healthy, uninjured bystander at the death of someone else, who will tell us that as that person who is dying passes away, the bystanders themselves have all these elements of the near-death experience." End quote. Here are a few of those N.D.E elements which may be part of a shared death experience. Out of body, bilocation, seeing known or unknown light sources, sensing, seeing, or hearing deceased family members and loved ones of the dying person, room changes to an alternate geometry, empathically co-live the life review, and telepathy. If you've never heard of anyone's shared death experience, I will example, starting with an excerpt, an experience of my own, written by Dr. Raymond Moody. It was May 8th, 1994, Mother's Day, and Moody was using a public telephone in a shopping mall in Las Vegas on a phone call with his mother. On May 9th, 1994, the day after Mother's Day, Raymond found out that his mother had just been diagnosed with cancer, and 2 weeks after that, she was dead. But before that sad occurrence, Raymond's family held a vigil, and at that moment of his mother's death, this is some of what had occurred. Quote, "We all held hands around the bed, my 2 sisters, their husbands, and Cheryl and I, and waited for the inevitable moment of death. And as we waited, it happened to us, a shared death experience. As we held hands around the bed, the room seemed to change shape, and 4 of the 6 of us felt as though we were being lifted off the ground. I had the feeling that the room had turned into the shape of an hourglass. I felt a strong pull, like a riptide that was pulling me out to the sea, only the pull was upward. "Look," said my sister, pointing to a spot at the end of the bed. "Dad's here. He's come back to get her." Everyone there reported later that the light in the room had changed to a soft and fuzzy texture. As all of this took place, there was great joy in the room. We all knew something truly incredible had happened to all of us as our mother died. It was as though the fabric of the universe had torn, and just for a moment, we felt the energy of that place called heaven. Although the term S.D.E. may be relatively new to North America, the phenomenon is not. In the late 1800s, the London Society for Psychical Research studied S.D.Es and entitled them as deathbed visions or deathbed coincidences. Now that's interesting because I always thought that the term deathbed visions only applied to those that were dying. The experience of a shared death include elements that are consistent throughout the centuries. Here is an earlier account of a shared death that was experienced by Karl Scala, a German poet, that occurred during World War I. Accounts of the phenomenon have been documented in a 2012 book entitled Parting Visions, co-authored by science writer and documentary filmmaker Paul Perry. According to the article Beyond Goodbye by John Blake, quote, "Scala was a soldier huddled in a foxhole with his best friend when an artillery shell exploded, killing his comrade. He felt his friend slump into his arms and die." End quote. It then describes Scala's N.D.E. in the following way, quote, "He," meaning Scala, "felt himself being drawn up with his friend above their bodies and then above the battlefield. Scala could look down and see himself holding his friend. Then he looked up and saw a bright light and felt himself going towards it with his friend. Then he stopped and returned to his body. He was uninjured except for a hearing loss that resulted from the artillery blast." End quote. A second prominent researcher in the S.D.E. field is William Peters, a licensed psychotherapist at the Family Therapy Institute in Santa Barbara, specializing in end-of-life counseling as a means towards psycho-spiritual evolution, and author of At Heaven's Door, What Shared Journeys to the Afterlife Teach About Dying Well and Living Better. He is also the founder and executive director of the Shared Crossing Project, where he and his research team collect and study extraordinary end-of-life experiences. In an interview conducted by M. Kinzel, Peters states that a shared death experience happens, quote, "feels like they shared in that person's transition. In some cases, this person will observe the initial stages of the afterlife, where they see the dying person there or sense it is where they are going. It is sharing the journey of the experience with the dying person. It is the movement from this human experience through the portal of death to another realm of existence, and the observer feels like they shared in that journey." End quote. Like Moody, Peters also had experiences with shared death, but before that, Peters had his own near-death experience, which he has termed as a rather classic N.D.E. It happened when he was 17 after breaking his back from a skiing accident. He held on to his N.D.E. experience for a number of years, which would eventually become part of the framework for his book At Heaven's Door, What Shared Journeys to the Afterlife Teach About Dying Well and Living Better. In 2000, William Peters volunteered at the Zen Hospice Project, where, as he states, he had formative and informative S.D.Es. His first S.D.E. occurred while reading to a dying client whose name was Ron. William recalls popping out of his own body and looking at Ron, who was also out of his body and was smiling at William. Mr. Peters didn't have a name for such experiences until he attended a lecture given by Dr. Raymond Moody. The topic? N.D.Es and S.D.Es. That was the meaning that would inspire Peters to start his organization and its research initiative to study the shared death experience. Speaking of research, there was an inductive content analysis, meaning collecting and analyzing data without preconceived categories or theories taken from the accounts and transcripts of interviews with 107 persons that reported a total of 164 S.D.Es in order to better understand the features and effects of the shared death experience. If memory serves, that study was linked to the Shared Crossing Project. Analysis of that research revealed 4 distinct modes of participation for the S.D.E. experiencer. Number 1, sensing, remotely sensing the transitioning or the passing of someone. 2, witnessing unusual phenomena that is related to death or death itself, such as bright light, room-changing dimensions, sensing or seeing entities. 3, accompanying. Feeling of accompanying the dying. You can accompany or move along with the dying person as they transition on the pathway to the afterlife. Number 4, assisting. Feeling of assisting the dying. The experiencer reports that they were brought into the experience to guide the dying along their pathway. Analysis of the same study revealed 3 major domains of S.D.E. effects, which are changes in belief, the reconciliation of grief, and the perception of continued relational bonds with the deceased. For my final pick for a pioneer of S.D.E., I chose Dr. Scott Taylor. Dr. Taylor holds a Ph.D. in educational leadership, is also the founder of the Expanded Awareness Institute, has a Minister of Spiritual Counseling degree, and, as of March 4th, 2019, President and Executive Director of the Monroe Institute, or TMI, which, according to their website, is the world's leading residential education center for exploring expanded states of consciousness. Plus, creator of an audio CD called Into the Light with HemiSync. Here is part of an explanation, which I paraphrased, that addresses what an S.D.E. is during an interview with Alex from Next Level Soulcast. Shared death is similar to a near-death experience, except the S.D.E. experiencer has no physical trauma, and the soon-to-be experiencer is more than likely sitting bedside, or they are asleep, or sitting at home, and then someone they know makes the final transition. Then an invitation of sorts goes out to the living from the dying person, and it is then that the shared death experience occurs. He continues, quote, "It's an actual death experience that someone else gets to participate in and with. So the living person not only witnesses the transition, but gets to participate in it. At times, that can involve many of the N.D.E. elements, including the life review of the other." I'm going to sidestep away from the doctor for a moment to talk about TMI, which was founded by Robert Monroe, the same Monroe who penned his 1971 book about his O.B.Es entitled Journey Out of the Body, the same Monroe who would become synonymous with the Gateway Experience. Monroe formed what was initially called RAM Enterprises back in 1953. A corporation that produced network radio programs, quiz shows, and the like. Then, in '56, that firm evolved into a research and development division. Monroe ventured forward while staying with the audio production platforms, searching for methods to be utilized for the then-known concept of sleep learning, brought forward back in 1927 by Alois Benjamin Salinger with his invention of the psychophone. Sleep learning, also known as hypnopedia, is an attempt to convey information to a sleeping person, usually by playing sound recordings while they sleep. By Monroe's account, back in 1958, during his own experiment with sleep learning, he experienced a physical sensation of paralysis and vibrations, which was accompanied by a bright light. These sensations would occur multiple times over a 6-week period until it crescendoed into his first out-of-body experience. In 1975, Monroe first registered for a patent on a method that he would become well known for, called hemispheric synchronization, aka hemisync, which uses binaural beats created through sound waves from audio exercises designed to stimulate brainwave functions until the left and the right hemispheres become synchronized. This method is said to assist with mental well-being, expanded states of consciousness, and a gateway into the non-physical. Monroe stated that hemisync serves as a ramp from the local road to the interstate in allowing people to go full steam ahead in the exploration of consciousness, avoiding all of the stops and starts. I tried the gateway experience and found it difficult to listen to Robert's voice, perhaps due to the 1950 era of radio speech. I believe they have switched it up using his daughter's voice in a newer version of that same method. And now, I'll make a beeline back to Dr. Scott Taylor. Dr. Taylor, like other S.D.E researchers, has had his own shared death experience in July 1981. This experience paved the way for his studies and research in N.D.Es and S.D.Es. In 81, his girlfriend of 6 months, a woman named Mary, was in a car accident with her son, 7-year-old Nolan. She died instantly and her son Nolan transitioned in less than a week. Scott Taylor recalls that his girlfriend's family had gathered around Nolan's hospital bed. When the boy's vital signs ceased, Scott saw Mary, his girlfriend, mother of Nolan, who had died 5 or 6 days prior, cross through the veil and scoop her son out of his body, which Scott witnessed and recalled as a most joyful moment. The two spirits then turned to Scott and included him in their hug, and then all three of them went to the light together. He felt intense and immense love. He stayed in that space for a while. Then the two spirits turned and continued on, and he returned to his body. Scott now knows that he bilocated during that event, an element that can be part of the shared death experience. 10 years later, as Scott was researching N.D.Es, he interviewed a relative of Mary's who not only had a previous N.D.E herself, but had also been in Nolan's hospital room when he transitioned. It was only after Scott had interviewed her that he found out that she too had experienced Nolan's crossing in much the same way that Scott did. Wow, I guess you could call that a shared death experience. Interesting. I wonder if either of them saw the other during their O.B.E. Such S.D.E tellings are profound and go a long way to support the stories of N.D.Es, because those that have experienced a shared death were not injured, and, as author Paul Perry states, quote, by virtue of two people or more experiencing a shared death experience, that makes it an objective experience that has independent witness, end quote. The experiencer is not dying, but share in the spiritual transition. As a result, one may gain an understanding of what will happen during transition. There is then, say, the possibility for decreased anxiety, an increase of hope surrounding death, and a heightened appreciation for one's day-to-day life. I will end this episode the way I began it, with what I think is one of the most succinct definitions of a S.D.E, and one that I happened upon just as I was finishing this episode. Quote, a living person who is well experiences the death experience of a person who is dying, end quote. Author Paul Perry. Thank you for taking your time to visit me here in these Orbicle Times. I've greatly enjoyed creating this cast, from the researching aspect, and that means no AI platform here, to recording, editing, and of course, meeting those of you over the airwaves. Thank you all for your contributions to this cast. And please check out episode 30 for information regarding future podcasts and summer plans. I can always be reached at orbitletimespodcast@gmail.com, and for my blogs, articles, images, and casts updates, visit www.orbitletimes.com. If you're interested or curious about orbs of the spirit kind, then I invite you to head over to my channel with the handle @SpiritOrbSightings. I can also be reached at spiritorbsightings@gmail.com. And take care, everybody. Orbicle Times podcast is written, produced, edited, and hosted by me, Kelly Jo, at Studio Spare Room.